So you've all seen the wonderful begonias out there, maybe in one of my begonia videos, and you know which particular begonias I'm referring to. I'm not talking about the bedding plant varieties or the large flowered tuberous types. They're lovely, have their place. No, I'm talking about the Rex types, the cane varieties, the rhizomatous varieties, the upright rhizomatous varieties. There are more groups out there, of course, but those are the main types of begonias that I and many other people try to grow either in a greenhouse like this or more commonly in a house or a conservatory. And recently a few folks have told me that they just can't grow them. They always die. So that's what this video is all about. How do you keep begonias alive? Let's get started. And we are in. Okay, so first of all, I'm always at pains to point out that anything I say here is very much from my experience. I'm not a botanist. This is a result of my own specific growing environment. These tips will likely only work in places with similar growth factors. And by that, I'm referring to light levels, as in intensity and duration, temperatures, humidity, all the usual stuff. But that doesn't mean that these tips won't be useful if you live in a place with different conditions to me. Us plant folks know that all knowledge is good, and you'll be able to use my experiences to complement and influence your own experiments with these fabulous and rewarding plants. Okay, so we're going to start with temperature. None of these begonias will take frost, none of the ones in here anyway, but there are some hardy varieties out there, but I choose to grow only tropical ones. My channel began with the name Tropical Plants at 53 degrees. So these make up the vast majority of begonias that we grow in a house or a heated greenhouse, but different varieties will differ in how much cold they can take and for what duration before showing signs of distress. My conservatory, for example, very often gets down to around 5 degrees Celsius through the coldest of the winter months, and for many weeks at a time. This will distress most of my begonias, but not all. The Bowerii types, and here we have Zumba and Tiger Paw, they tend to cope really well with the lower temperatures, as does Begonia Black Knight that you just saw earlier. I've even heard that if humidity is very low, Begonia longus ciliata will cope below zero, but I must stress that that's in a very, very dry environment. So for our purposes, if growing in a house or a greenhouse, keep the temperature above 12 degrees Celsius if you can. Not generally a problem in a house, but definitely in a greenhouse. But you want the temperature higher still if you don't really want any cold related issues. An upright rhizomatous type like Begonia griffon, also known as Begonia pegasus, can defoliate at 12 degrees Celsius or below, but don't give up on it. When temperatures start to increase again, it should spring back to life and be as good as ever. At the other end of the temperature scale, providing you're not putting your plants in full sun through a window, the temperature should never get too high for them. So let's talk about light issues. Now many people think of these begonias, the ones in here, as shade loving, or certainly compared to tuberous, this is a tuberous variety, or a semperflorens types, which are usually known as sun loving. It's true that many of the species do grow in the understudy areas of tropical forests, but that doesn't mean that they actively prefer lower light levels. Like many other understory plants, they're competing with each other for as much light as they can get. So far, my experience shows this to be true. Without exception, well, perhaps this one is an exception, each one of my begonias in here, regardless of variety, has performed better with increased light. I've found that many issues miraculously disappear when you add a decent grow light into the mix. Issues like leaf and root rot, lackluster growth, susceptibility to pests, and even the cold. Begonias can and do cope well with lower light levels of a house. They can even adjust and adapt to them, but if your plants are showing signs of distress, just try improving the light. This particular one is a tuberous one. Yes, it will take full sun, but of course not through the glass. So let's talk about media and watering. Now I've linked these two together because the two are linked. Your media, what you put in the pot, what you grow it in, should really reflect your own conditions and your experiences with a plant. For example, I always start with a general purpose compost with added perlite just to aid the drainage and to help speed up the media drying out. In my environment, that's generally a good mixture because I have low temperatures in winter for an extended period of time and high humidity for an extended period of time. Perfect combination for moles, mildew and rot. Now, let's say I start to notice if one plant is frequently drying out too quickly and frequently wilting. That's telling you to change the media to something more water retentive. Now, of course, you could water it more. I choose to change the media. So I add some moss into the mix or reduce the amount of perlite or use a different media altogether that has the properties and characteristics I'm looking for. Does that make sense? You need to carry out the same process with your plants for your environment. For me, I like my plants to dry out for a few days before re-watering. That's the general rule that works for me, but there are exceptions. I grew a very large Begonia luxurians, a species begonia, and it used to need loads and loads of water, mainly because it was very big. It was about 5 foot tall in the greenhouse, of course, and it was still in quite a small pot. So I adjusted. I put it in a bigger pot, I adjusted the media, and I could even get away with putting a little tray of water underneath it because I knew that it would suck all that up before it saturated itself. Got to be careful if you're doing something like that. Now, if you can see that your media is still damp, it doesn't matter how long ago when you last watered it, giving it more water will not help. Now, someone recently told me that their begonias grown in the house prefer to remain slightly moist. That makes perfect sense as the house is going to be warmer and drier than in my greenhouse. There's no single answer to how long or how frequently or how much you need to water something, just as much as there isn't a single answer to what media to use. You've got to experiment, take on board what other people say and work with your own environment. But there is maybe one rule. Never heard anyone say that their begonias like to sit in a tray of water for extended periods of time, don't forget that last bit, or like to remain thoroughly wet. Of course they don't. So let's talk humidity. Now, many people like to tell you that these types of begonias love humidity. I'm going to say it's not as important a factor as you might think, mostly. I think in general, folks tend to overplay the humidity thing, and that unless you're in an environment that consistently receives less than 30% humidity, it's not going to be the key factor that kills your begonias. Now, you might say, well, I'm in a house, I have central heating on through the winter, that will reduce the humidity, and that's true to an extent, but I tested my own house with several humidity meters in different places, and I found that although it was less than outside, it wasn't actually by very much, not enough to make any difference anyway. In general, it followed the humidity levels that were outside. If it rained outside, the humidity in the house also went up. So in summary, unless you live in or near a desert, don't worry too much about this one factor killing your begonias. You certainly are unlikely to need a humidifier on near your begonias. Other factors are more likely to be causing any issues you might have, but if you're not sure, measure your humidity and take the guesswork out of it. Okay, now let's talk pests. Thankfully, I haven't had many pests to contend with on my begonias, and if yours are in the house, you probably won't either. Occasional slugs and snails, but I guess that's not happening in the house, or at least I hope not. Spider mites are probably the main one to watch for, but for the most part, begonias are pretty resistant to many of those sap-sucking pests, probably all the hairs that they have. Now let's discuss the oddities. I said earlier that humidity isn't generally a factor in begonia growth, but I've found one exception and there may be more out there. I'm currently growing a species called Begonia arachnoidea. It's not looking too great at the moment. I'll come to that in a second. I found it really does start to quickly decline in humidity below about 80%, but it is a species, and species are always more fussy than hybrids. Another exception I've found, this time with pests, is Begonia fuchsioides, but again it's a species, and probably because of the smooth leaves it did suffer from spider mites at one time, so that's something to watch out for. Another random bit of information is about rhizomatous types. Now this one, Begonia solid silver, it did have huge leaves on it. I've cut them all off, believe it or not. You can see the stumps there. But look what's happened to the rhizome. Now when they hit the end of the pot, it can suddenly stunt or stop growth altogether. In this case, the rhizome's gone off to the edge of the pot and over the pot, but that will slow it down, and I don't want that to happen. So beware of this happening, and it happens with all the rhizomatous types. So the answer to it is either to dig it up and chop a bit off and get it to grow from another point, or to do a division, or to simply put it in a larger pot so that the whole of the thing can actually root down into the soil. And finally, talking about oddities, I did have a species that once grew like crazy, but for reasons that still escape me, it suddenly turned up its toes and died. Still don't know why to this day. Happens to the best of us. So I hope some of these tips will help you grow these amazing plants, or at least encourage you to experiment. I've tried to cover a lot today, but of course I can't cover everything, so please put any comments or suggestions as usual down below in the comments. And if you just love looking at begonias or enjoy deciding which variety to grow next, these two begonia videos on screen were begonia tours I made, and I think they're a couple of years apart, so you'll be able to take a look at how my collection has changed and evolved over time, and get your pen and paper ready to jot down the names of those you love. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.